Welcome, everyone. I titled this session, The Importance of Identity Governance in Today's World, and the short answer is, I can sum this all up. The auditors are making you do it. Beyond that, can't help. Come on, not advancing the slides. Well then, just have to do it this way. I'm sorry. I tried it earlier, I don't know why. So a quick bit about me. I've been part of the TTP since I think '98. I still don't remember. Lots of cool solutions, knowledge partner. I do consulting. Probably heard of me. I would ask, as just a side note, consider my book. It's on IDM tokens. I went through them one by one. I do have to update it for 4.8 and 4.8.1 because they did actually add some new tokens, but I haven't gotten to that yet. You can buy it off Lulu. I have another book on IDM Validator. They apparently forgot to write a manual for it. They really actually didn't write a manual for it, so I did. And because of the opportunity to put dead pets on the covers, I saw this as a win-win. I have the cover for book 3 done, and it's yet another dead pet. So good news is, well, I still have 2 more pets to go, so I'm good.
What's it about?
Okay. It's a beginner's guide to IDM.
Excellent, thank you.
I think that is something that is necessary. I just have to actually do it. Oh, editing is hell. It's long and there's lots of it. Okay, so how did we get here? A quick review, just because identity governance is really, in the industry, is becoming sort of the next evolution of IDM. And so let's do a quick review. With IDM, the goal was, let's automate user-related stuff. HR starts a new user, push them to create them in directory in the identity vault, then have policies and whatnot that push them out to all the various systems, do what's necessary, and this was usually hard-coded policies, such as if this attribute changes, do something. But that got out of hand, right? Because you started hard-coding everything, and then changes required running it through some testing and prod and dev, and they may not want to do that. We had a customer who had 127 rules to handle this. It was a little nutty, but it turned out a single mapping table of 127 rows solved that problem. But that still was a bad solution, because now your change is in a mapping table instead of inside policy, but you're still manually updating these things. So what that did was it moved the abstraction out of the policy and into a mapping table, which is useful, but not everything. Micro Focus, then Novell, introduced this concept of entitlements, which was a way to represent something you have in another system without necessarily syncing it direct. The easy example is groups. Used to be you did a group in the vault and it synced to AD, and so you had it here. So all you would do is add them to the group in the vault. That would sync to AD and done. An entitlement is a attribute that has a payload. So group is my example, has a value that the driver can identify, and it will go in the target system and add whatever the target is, whatever the payload specifies. So you're not storing everything you're not synchronizing things direct out of the vault. You are instead using this abstraction and entitlement. And that's the XML entitlement ref attribute. So we then went on to, how do we get to grant these entitlements? So we could still do that hard-coded, but that doesn't seem like the right direction. So then we had the role-based entitlements driver, or also known as the entitlement service driver, because if it doesn't have 2 names, it's not confusing enough. And that basically allowed you to do LDAP dynamic groups to define who gets an entitlement. So now we've moved it out of policy, and we've moved it into these entitlement policies, which was really quite powerful, because you could do LDAP dynamic groups, allow you to operate on the data in the vault, and you didn't really, it was actually tricking out the event system, because you can't event off an LDAP dynamic group, and so it would just poll every hour. So it was actually both a step forward and a step backwards at the same time. So great, we finally got everything automatic. But then it turns out I really need a person in the flow, because it turns out this particular thing is important or risky or dangerous, and I just can't let them have it. So we need to handle ad hoc requests. Well, we have a human who has to intervene and make a decision. And honestly, it's not about making a decision, it's about taking the blame. It's all about blame casting. So we automated it, and then we shoved the person in it to slow it down. And so we got the idea of workflows with roles and resource requests. So in IDM right now, we have roles and resources. They come in 3 levels, and the idea is at level 10, you give the finest grain permissions, like this grants 3 group memberships, or this grants access to a system in a group. Level 20 was more, this is more like a job function. So someone in HR probably needs this set of permission roles. So level 20 would have some child level 10 roles. And then finally, level 30, you'd hopefully map to your businesses, to the business processes. So, you know, HR can, I don't know, HR consultant level 7 needs these 2 different level 20 IT roles that each have 5 or 10 level 10 permission roles in them. And so at the end of the day, you grant them this one level 30 business role, and they pick up a whole bunch of other things through inheritance. And so if you could map that business role to a job title, to something coming out of HR, then that really makes automation nice. What's nice is along the way, you can still have approvals at any of those stages for any of those steps. Someone's mic is on and it's repeating, echoing. Anyway, so the next logical evolution of that is governance. We've got IDM set up to manage permissions and access automatically and by human request. But now you actually have to prove that everyone who has something has it for the right reason. And really, governance is about certifying, is the word they use, but really it's proving that all the people have what they have when they should, and no one has what they shouldn't have. And so the ultimate goal is to run a certification campaign. And in a certification campaign, you review what each person has, and someone, a human, has to approve. In other words, they keep the access or revoke it and remove it. Now, if you think for a second about how many different systems you have, how many different permission style thingies you might have, you could imagine this could get ridiculously out of hand quickly. It really can get out of hand quickly. So how does it work? Well, so at a low level, this is not the same as IDM. Lots of overlapping functions, but they're different. Because IDM is a real-time event-driven system. You want a change to come out of HR, you want it to flow to all the other systems. Now, it might trigger a workflow, it might trigger an approval because of the rules that you have, or the policies, or how you've configured yourself, and that's fine, but it's still real-time, even if you've shoved a human in the flow to slow it down. But IDG looks at it totally different. It's collecting and reviewing data on a schedule, and that schedule is often quarterly. Like, you're not going to run a campaign every day. You're not going to run a campaign every month. God willing, you don't have to do even quarterly, but you might have to. So if you have to do every 4 months, that's a lot of work. So it collects the data, and it's and so the idea is that you can do it on this set of data once a month. IGA, which is the new thing, Identity Governance, I don't even know what it stands for. IDM is Identity Management. IDG is Identity Governance. Identity and Governance Administration, I think, is what IGA stands for. And that's the next evolution of IDM, and they're going to merge the two so that we get event-driven IDM with governance built in. And so Tom, on an earlier session, Tom Burt, who is the product manager, was mentioning that when they initially designed IDG, they specifically wanted it to be separate because the things you want to do in IDM are different than the things you want to do in IDG. And now, having run with it for a few years, they're getting ready to merge them back together and put it together. And I'll say that the competitors to Micro Focus in general don't quite have the event-driven at all. Well, they don't quite have the event-driven side. So this actually will be a very nice piece in the market compared to some of the competitors. So at a low level, the very first thing you have to do once you've got it started is you have to start collecting data. And there's a really important distinction that happens there. There's this notion of an identity versus an account. IDG is trying to represent a human. I don't understand why they're anti-dog and cat. They are kind of people, right? And so an identity represents a person, not an employee, but more of a person. So it doesn't matter what they are, but it does represent a person who's probably able to log in. And that's the identities we collect. Now, you often collect it from the Identity Vault or from Active Directory or from somewhere else. So the authoritative source for all the humans in scope of your project come from somewhere. But once they're collected, they are identities. But Humans do things, unlike cats, and to do that, they have to be allowed access to different systems. And so we have this notion of a thing called an account, which means it's another system in which you have some kind of access. And then there's a permission, which is an attempt to explain, define, or quantify the various permissions you have. Permissions can take any form you want. The classical one for eDirectory and Active Directory would be groups. If you use the IDM collector, it knows about roles and resources and it considers those permissions. If you're talking to a database, it could be some value in a table, or it could be a permission in the database. If you're talking about SAP, where everything is done by these 4-character transaction codes, then access to a transaction code would be considered a permission. And what you try to do is you try to get all this data into the database. And they're stored as separate things. Now, as it happens, your identity and your account can be collected from the same place. So I just recently set up a system where the identity came out of the identity vault, because they have IDM. They have a bunch of connected systems, and I collected the identities out of there. That's because that's the authoritative source. There's 3 different HR systems feeding into it. Then I collected the accounts from the same location, and each driver that has an entitlement counts as an application which has accounts, and then all the entitlements count as permissions. And I collected them all. It was interesting, 50,000 users and 1 million permissions. That's going to be fun to review. So once you have the identity and account data, you try to group things together because, as I just said, reviewing 1 million permissions is never going to happen in our lifetime. So IDG doesn't use the 3 roles, the level 10, 20, 30 that IDM uses, which on the one hand is a shame because that would map really nicely and be easy. On the other hand, they're trying to take a step forward and say, really, there's only 2 sort of kind of roles you need, 2 basic types of roles. And really, if you think about it, level 10s, 20s, and 30s, you could probably collapse the 10s and the 20s together and just have the equivalent of 30 and 10. And so thus we get business roles, which are still the equivalent of level 30s, and technical roles, which are kind of like level 10s and 20s collapsed. Business roles can be driven by data that's almost like LDAP dynamic groups, except it's coming out of the database. And so people will will be assigned, you can have business roles manually assigned or automatically assigned based on data. I gave the silly example of the L attribute, where each location gets a different business role. And then technical roles are meant to be groupings of permissions. So business roles can contain technical roles and permissions, and technical roles are an attempt to say, here's a whole bunch of roles that are common to this particular person, to this user, to this thing. So why bother with roles at all? And one of my favorite H.L. Mencken quotes is, what is it? Democracy is the right of the people to vote for what they want and get it good and hard. The goal of governance is to govern, and as H.L. Mencken said, and hard. But it ought not to be so difficult. Let's try not to make it impossible. You know, the auditors may say you have to do it, but if you can't convince all the people who are official approvers across your enterprise, campuses, or I guess in Boz's case, dozens of schools, it's never going to happen. So it doesn't matter what the auditors say. It's just not going to happen if it's really hard. So here's just a silly example. 10,000 users is not out of the scope of the size of most of us. But if each had 30 different permissions or accounts to review, that really probably wouldn't happen actually reviewing 300,000 permissions. So what if you can group some of these things, which is the perfect use for roles? Well, how do you group them? You can do this all sorts of different ways. You can manually set them up yourself. There's obvious ones you know about, and those are ones you'll probably just set. Or you can mine for them. And in fact, you can mine for technical roles or for business roles. And so technical roles, what they're looking for are common permissions that people share. And they try to group those permissions together. You give it a name, and then it starts to be a thing that can be part of other things that you can use. I recently was working on one that had a technical that found 370 permissions through role mining. I got to tell you, I never would have come up with that one manually. I didn't understand the system well enough, but it was really interesting because it found it quite nicely. So you could imagine that if you're in a certification campaign and a reviewer gets one of these users, that instead of seeing 370 individual permissions to review, you can set it so that they just have to review one technical role. Well, that really cuts down on the work. But it gets better. But if it's part of a business role and the business role is already certified and approved, then the person, they just have to say, yes, they deserve that business role. That's good. And because you might have multiple technical roles and other things inside that business role. And so what we're trying to do is build a layer of abstractions to make this reasonable and doable. As I noted earlier, business roles can be assigned based on identity data. That's an important point. It's based on data on the identity, not on the accounts. And so you want to make sure when you choose your identity source, you choose wisely. We had an interesting customer that did this where they had what they called a registry tree, and there everyone got strange, GUID-like usernames. Then they would, because that's what HR was populating, then they would sync to the authentication tree, and they wanted to collect based off the registry data, but use the things that were in the identity tree. So unfortunately, that one was a tricky bit. Also, we had to switch around where authentication was because there were no passwords in the registry tree. So it turned out that was just a bad choice on their part in hindsight, and we made it work by having some fun with it. But we got it to go. And once you have some of these business roles, you can then choose during review. So one of the nice things is a lot of, I have yet to personally exhaust all the options in the various types of reviews. There's a bunch of them, but at each time you can choose to do a review of one thing at a time, one user at a time, one permission at a time, one group of users at a time. And when you're doing, you can actually say, ignore the technical or business roles and make them review everything the hard way. You can make them do it the easy way, you can make them do it the hard way. And it all depends on your business case. Obviously, every single installation is going to be different, and they're really trying to cover it. But imagine for a second that the review is only on things that aren't part of a technical role or a business role. If you do that, that means, so my example of the 370 entitlements they got for this one system, well, it wasn't for one system, it was scattered across multiple systems. But reducing the number of things you had to approve really and truly can reduce the scope and the length of time it takes to certify. And these certification campaigns often last for weeks, in that you don't just tell people, we're going to kick off this review, everyone gets an email, you have 6,000 people to approve, and it needs to be done by 4 o'clock today. Again, you could try it, it's just never going to work, and so there's really no point in doing it. So instead, you generally run them for a week or two with some escalations where if you don't do yours, it goes to your manager, and they're going to be mad at you, and if they don't do theirs, it goes to their manager, and eventually it goes to the CEO, and if he has to deal with any of this crap, someone's getting fired. So, I don't know, when I worked at a university, it was union, so no one ever got fired, but I'm sure that's probably not quite true now. But the goal is, make it easier, manage it by exception. You guys all remember the file system permission modeling, manage by exception. And this way you can only handle the things that fall out of what you expect. So everyone who's got a business role because of HR data, I'm just going to ignore. That's all good. So that knocks off usually huge swaths. If you're able to set up business roles based on location, job code, job types, employee types, things like that, then people automatically fall into the business roles. The permissions that are granted because of those business roles stop being in scope of review, because you can actually do a review of just business roles, review them, and as long as someone approves those, you can inherit the certification towards the next step. And then all you're looking for are the strange ones, the exceptions. And if you're lucky, you'll catch all the admins, like the rest of us in this group, who probably have way more permissions than we deserve, than we need. And the trick is, how do you keep people from noticing you've got them so they don't take them away? Sometimes called the 80-20 rule, and you can come up with your own name for it if you like. So The reason all this is happening is that certification really is hard. You really won't believe how many permissions you have in your environment and how much would need to be reviewed if you did it the old-fashioned way by hand, in a spreadsheet, whatever. One other thing they do that's kind of neat is each application, each permission, and at many, many levels, you can specify a risk, which is kind of a neat idea. And it runs from 0 to 100. What does 0 mean? What does 100 mean? Totally up to you. If you want to do it like low point scoring, where 0 is the most important and 100 is the least, you can do that. Generally, in North America, higher is better. I'm sure there are countries around the world where lower is better, like golf, ballroom dancing. Neither of them are sports. And so you could then, what's neat is if you assign risks at a lower level to individual permissions, then you can actually just say, I just need to review the risky stuff. And the question then becomes, how risky is risky? And so you can actually give it a number, anyone over 30. What does 30 mean? Completely up to you. These are complete fake points. They're entirely up to you to figure out what you want to do. So the big question you should be asking yourself, and in particularly in the scope of IGA coming, is why not just do this in IDM? Why can't we just do this in IDM? Why did they decide to do it in a separate product, IDG? Hint, it was probably for licensing, but neither here nor there. But it's important, there actually are a couple of really important differences between the two that matter. So identity governance is designed to collect data from non-live sources, whereas IDM is for live. So it'll do text files, it'll do REST, it'll do SOAP, it'll do LDAP. It does ServiceNow, which is really REST, SAP, which is BAPI, the API, lots of fun things. And you can write your own. The SDK is astonishingly poorly documented. And that's possibly actually saying something. Well, I guess 0. You can't go lower than 0, but it's unfortunate. I think it would be really neat. And what you have to do is you actually have to look in an existing one and sort of copy code. So you have to learn from the ones that are there, and the jars are available. You can go look at them. What I personally like is actually to write my own fulfillment class that does multiple fulfillments. We'll come to that in a minute, but I haven't gotten to that yet. So where, in the good old days with IDM, we thought, well, we'll integrate everything, the door code system, the key card, the meal plan, and it kind of never happened. We got the high-end stuff, the big stuff, the hard stuff, and then everyone sort of lost interest. Mostly because getting live access is hard. It's not that it's hard to do, it's hard to get them to give you access. Fighting with HR to let you have access to a database table, if you haven't done it, you haven't lived. Oh my God, sometimes it's amazing. No, we'll give you a view that's read-only, that's actually cloned to another server. The nonsense they'll sometimes go through to make this difficult can be funny. But dumping out a CSV is what some of these systems live for, I'd swear. Like, if you've ever done IDM projects, and you're talking to people, they're like, well, why don't we just give you a CSV every day? Well, because we wanted live access. So you do something, we do something, we feed it back, you do something, and it's all instant, it's done. And instead, like, no, a 24-hour cycle is fast enough for us. Or maybe we'll give it to you once a week. So, and then of course, their CSV that they dump is really from a copy of the database, because they don't want to do it off the live one. And that database is cloned every night, but the cycle of when they actually make the CSV is 12 hours later. So you're always 36 hours behind. And they're like, well, that should be fine, right? Well, it turns out that getting these CSVs turns out to be not so hard. Most applications will often just dump one for you. Pretty much, they would much prefer to do that than almost anything else. And so you can get more systems integrated faster. And really that's the goal here, is IDG needs to collect as many permissions from as many different sources as possible. That's really what you want. But an interesting twist is we need to persist the state, because remember, these reviews are running for weeks on end. I mean, literally expect about a month or so to run a review quite seriously in any reasonably sized enterprise, unless you have like super aggressive, interested people who are just going to just jump right on it you spend most of your time nagging them. And in fact, there's this whole notification system in it about how often you nag people. And the amount of nags you can generate is way too high. But the reality is if you don't nag them, they're just not going to do it. And so what we actually need is we need a static image of the state of the system at the time we started the certification campaign. It doesn't make sense to do it live because things are changing under the covers. So you've got this review. Should I revoke or should I approve it? And I have to make a decision, but it's changed under the covers since I last did it. Now, it may still change under the covers, but at least the view you're seeing is static. And so you're still making a decision based on the data at that point. I think one of the interesting things that's going to come in IGA 6, which is where they merge IDM and IDG, is as we start doing this stuff without perhaps that safety blanket of a static image, where we get more underneath it, where we get to see as things are changing. Because although I just said that, it would be nice if you're reviewing someone and they have this permission and it's already gone, that when you go to look at the reviews, it checks, oops, it's already done, and just deletes it from your list. But I am looking forward to IDG and how we do it and how that happens. Okay, so you've gotten all this data into it. You're now approving and denying it. So what are you going to do next? Well, you have to fulfill it. You have to fulfill that approve, that review. Can you write back to the various systems? Well, you've got IDM in there. Writing back to IDM is pretty easy. And then that's great. If you just change the entitlements around or change their role assignments, then IDM will go out and fulfill it for you. And then on your next collection, it'll double check to see that it's done. There's ServiceNow integration for some of the manual fulfillments because people seem to love ServiceNow. That one boggles my mind as I use it. I don't understand the appeal. Use a bunch of different help desk systems, and ServiceNow would not be my first choice, but personal preference. And so sometimes for these systems that dump CSVs, maybe you dump a CSV that you send back to them, or maybe you just send an email that they have to respond to, or you send them a task that they have to do, or you just send a ticket via ServiceNow, which seems to be the preferred way because then you track it somewhere else. One of the things I was talking about that is not problematic, but it's hard, is each fulfillment, because there's many different things you could be fulfilling. You could be saying, take away the account, take away the permission, add a permission, add an account. They actually have like 13 or 16 different granular file permissions of things you could fulfill. The problem is you can't have one fulfiller do two things. So if take away an account, you make a change in the identity vault and send a ServiceNow ticket, out of the box, you can't do it. I'm relatively certain I know how to make it do two things at once based on the same data, because one of the nice things is it's all written in Java and you can inherit classes, and their classes are all there. And so when I have some time, my goal is to write a custom fulfiller class using the completely undocumented SDK to then take in the data and then literally pass it to the existing LDAP class, so it'll do it to IDM, and then take the same data and pass it to the ServiceNow class, existing ServiceNow class, and send that on to them. And so then I get one fulfiller, which is all I'm allowed to have for each type of fulfillment, and it'll do two or more things. And the trick is how many things do you want it to do, and this could get particularly funny and interesting and flexible. So I am looking forward to attempting that. And, before I go there. So you realize is once you've got fulfillment, there's something else you can do. Because on the one hand, we could do certifications. We can review everybody what they've got, make sure it's valid, add, remove as necessary, and actually add, remove as necessary. Well, at that point, why don't we just make this our place to request access? Why don't we just have manual requests that I can go in, just like in user app, and request to here and have it go out and fulfill it. And this has the advantage that we're going to be hitting more systems than just IDM. And so we expand that access request in user app to access request in IDG to not just the IDM managed systems, but all the other systems that we've managed to convince to give us CSVs and then give us manual access.
Jeff?
Yes?
This is your 15-minute warning.
Thank you. So one step I didn't talk about here, but I should, is that part of the process of a certification campaign is you kick off the campaign with all the rules you want. Messages go out to all the people who have to do approvals. How do you decide who they are? It could be manager, it could be attribute based, and it could be this thing I'll talk about in a minute called coverage maps. Then they do it. And at some point when they're complete, or even before they're complete, you go collect the data again. One of the downsides to collecting the data on a daily basis, which is what you're going to be instantly could want to do, or hourly, right? Because you're used to IDM, you want snap, 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 is the database keeps a copy of every collection. And so if you're collecting 50,000 users with, I don't know, say I don't even know how much space it takes. Say it takes up a gig of space. Every collection, the database gets a gig bigger, a gig bigger, a gig bigger, a gig bigger, and it grows crazy. And typically people don't use this on small systems. They want it on large systems. And then cleaning up the data can be quite slow because while databases can be quick, when you're moving gigs and gigs and gigs and gigs of data that you're just deleting, it can be relatively slow. And so you want to, so when you do that second collection, it then compares the results and it said, did the revoke that I sent in get done, and is it done? And it's not certified until it's end-to-end completed. And so we're back to the proving it, which was the ultimate goal of this at the beginning, proving it to the auditors. We collected the data, we decided who needed to review it, the person reviewed it, they made a decision, they said, go take away this access. We collected another time, oh yes, they did take away the access, we're done. If they didn't take away the access, that's still a problem and it's not yet complete. So they really do try to close the circle, close the loop. And it's really complicated, which is interesting. It's actually kind of fun. So at a high level, it really is a simple concept, right? Collect from all these different sources, review it, fix it, review it again, and you're done. But really and truly, the details are legion. They just, every single time, keep coming into details. They've done a pretty good job at 3.6.1. This is much, much better than it was at the early releases. It has some really neat features, and coverage maps happen to be one of my favorite new things. I don't have a simple way to explain it, but what they've done is they give you the ability to import a CSV that really they've sort of defined their own search language to be used in a CSV, because here's the problem. I have 1,000 users and I need to figure out who needs to approve access for an application for each user. Well, it'd be nice if the application owner would do it all. That'd be great. One application owner, he gets to review 1,000 users. Well, he might agree to that at first because, you know, people don't like giving up their permission, their control easily, but he might agree at first, but after the first review cycle, he's like, no way in hell. All right, now I'm going to dump it to their managers. Well, their managers are going to point, I have no clue what to do about this stuff. That's really the application manager guy supposed to control the fine-grained permissions. Not me, I don't know. So then he'll say, okay, well, I'll appoint 6 people or 10 people. Each one's going to handle 100 users. And it turns out we're nicely bifurcated. So we have 10 locations. I'm going to appoint 1 person per location, and they're going to have to review it. Okay, well, I don't quite have that linkage of the person in charge based on a location and the location a user is in. That's kind of 3 hops. I have 2 hops. I have the location, I have the user and their location. I have the user and their manager. All that's easy. But I almost need to go 3 or more hops. I need to say the person who's appointed to be the reviewer for this location that this user is in. And so a coverage map has this funny little language internal to itself where you can specify on the identity, so for the approver, I'm going to look at the, I'm going to look at the identity object, and I'm going to look at their L, and if it's this value, then the approver in the second column is going to be based on the identity, based on this custom field I made where I say, and they're in charge of approving it. And so it allows you to do some really neat things. If you ever take the training for it, it's like the coverage map is an optional addendum thing. And I absolutely recommend you do it because it's really hard to grasp the point of coverage maps. So once you do, you start seeing how they can solve all sorts of really neat problems in this space. And honestly, I think it is the most clever thing they did in the entire product. There's very little to show about it. I would have shown it. It's like a spreadsheet. So I can't come up with a way to quickly do it. something that IDM has that's a little different than other vendors, excuse me, IDG has, is they have, for Active Directory and eDirectory, they have what are called identity collector with changes. So there's the identity vault collector, and there's the identity vault collector with changes. There's the Active Directory collector and the Active Directory collector with changes. And in both cases, what it does is it will pick up changes as they happen off the system. So the identity vault with changes, you have to install the changelog module from, the bidirectional EDIR driver. They basically leverage that, which is actually the IDM DX event engine stripped down just to do eventing without then passing it onto the VRDIM, the actual IDM engine. And the Active Directory one uses universal sequence numbers. But the goal there is you could trigger what they call micro-certifications. And so if particular things on a user change outside of our quarterly cycle, I'm going to kick off a certification. Their location changed, and since location is triggering business roles, and business roles are triggering hundreds and hundreds of permission changes, I want to validate that that was a correct change. And so you could actually then kick off, since only 2 users changed this week, you could kick off 2 reviews, 1 per user, based off that data change, which is immensely more powerful. And so I think this is part of what they call continuous compliance. I think it's a much bigger space. But basically, as you're going, things, you get yourself in compliance, you get yourself compliant by reviewing and certifying everything. And then as events happen and change, you try to pick it up. We don't quite have a count with changes collectors yet, but I'm sure they're coming because it's the next logical step. And as we get to IGA, we're going to start seeing more and more of the, you can see this is where the event-driven parts start to feed into this more static view thing. And at that point, I'm basically done and good for questions. I just thought I'd leave some references. If you're not using the new community site for IDM, IDG, I don't really watch the Zen or the OES ones, but I know they're good. They're being covered really well. This link here that I give you, I find is really the easiest way to monitor for new messages. You're going to get ArcServe and Fortify, which are really, really busy forums. But the IDM, IDG, NAM, eDirectory, and oddly ZenWorks fall into this one link, so you can see what's new relatively easily. I quite like this. This is the link I monitor, and I find it useful. I have to update this because it turns out August 17th, they're turning off wiki.novell.com. Actually, it's wiki.microfocus now. Wiki.microfocus.com. Those bastards, they killed the wiki. They didn't port it to community. They're not porting it to community, and I got to update these and move mine somewhere else. I just haven't decided where to do it yet. And of course, if you guys do IDM, Sentinel, NAM, IDG, please contact me. And I do work as a consultant during the day, and we're always glad for new customers. Any questions?
Not seeing any hand raises so far.
I do recall that Tom has talked that IDM customers are going to get a IDG Lite entitlement, just as they've done an AA Lite, but I don't know the specific details. And that might be an interesting way to get into. I don't know quite what's stripped out of the Lite version. Amusingly, I do know it's done by the license code. There's different license codes that enable and hide features. Oh, someone's got a hand up. I can't quite read it. Aaron asks, is MySQL or...
Okay, and actually, Geoffrey, I have a question because it's you're talking about CSV import, but one of the one of the issues with CSV import, this is by design, that you have no way to collect what removed from CSV. For example, user deleted, and you have no way to detect it, this deletion. So it means if you have, for example, access provision for specific users, it's this user never come in CSV. How you can change it?
So the goal, I don't know the actual answer to that, but what it does is it knows the last collection and it knows the current collection, and the database, and when they compare the 2 rows in the database, part of the process of, they call collecting and publishing it, is to identify the changes. So I don't know if it does it right now. I've never tried. But I could see how they would do it if you were going to do it in the database. Because they've got the previous collection and the current collection, they can generate the differences to figure that out, which I understand. How do you put a deleted row in a CSV?
I see. Okay, because it's only by timestamp. Yeah, if timestamp not changed, but you need special logic to detect this. Okay.
Yeah, but that's not how IDG does it inside the database, though. Everybody gets a second row and a third row and a fourth row, and then the latest one is promoted to active.
I see. Okay.
Which is very database intensive. Aaron asks, is MySQL or Postgres used more in your experience for IDG? Honestly, everyone's been using Microsoft SQL or Oracle so far that I've been doing it with. Not done anything in Postgres or MySQL. You can, it comes with Postgres if you want to do it local and you don't have a database, but we've been doing it on reasonably bigger database servers than just the local one. It's just usually too big for it. I don't know if it's too big for it. They're big and painful. And it's still not fast. Role mining can take quite a while to kick out results. Oh, on a funny side note, the timeout for the web interface is generally shorter than the amount of time it takes to finish the automatic role mining, the first few passes till you sort of clean stuff up. So you actually have to boost how long the timeout is, because it turns out you can't get back to the session that has the results of your role mining if you time out. Yeah, whoever thought of that one.
No other hands? No, doesn't look like it.
Then I'll take 1 minute just to say, as a side note, as a personal thing outside of work, outside of TTP, outside of the articles, I also run an IDM user group. Try to get people to present sessions on interesting things in the IDM space. It started because I hit the point of where do I learn more stuff about IDM? And I thought, I'm going to use you people, because if I get a whole bunch of people to sign up, and it turns out they account at the current, it's about 100 people who represent about 6 million user licenses. I can go to Tom Burt and say, hey, Tom, look, if you come and present for an hour, you're going to hit customers who've bought 6 million user licenses. This seems like a valid use of your time. It's much more effective than just talking to me. And so I'm really using you, so I'm always looking for more people so I can say, oh, look, now we're at 7 million. Ooh, and more and more and more. So please, feel free to join. Email me personally and I'll add you. It's not fancy, it's nothing special. It's just me maintaining it.